On this edition of Primetime Politics, Canadians continue to face record waits for passports. We'll hear from this former senior public servant who worked on the file, and he says the government was forewarned and it could all have been avoided. And our journalist panel will look at the spring sitting of Parliament, the highs and the lows, the biggest issues, and the unfinished business. But we start with Canadian reaction to the historic ruling on Friday by the United States Supreme Court, striking down the constitutional protection of a woman's right to abortion. Prime Minister Trudeau and Foreign Affairs Minister Joly reacted to the ruling, speaking with reporters at the Commonwealth Summit in Rwanda.
Today's a difficult day. The judgment coming out of the United States is an attack on women's freedom, and quite frankly, it's an attack on everyone's freedoms and rights. Let me be really, really clear. In Canada, we will always defend women's rights to choose and continue to work to expand access to the full range of reproductive and health and services across the country. But today, I think of those generations of women around the world, and specifically in the United States, who fought so hard to gain rights and continue to fight today to get more and more rights, because there's still so much more work to do, and are facing this devastating setback. It shows how much standing up and fighting for rights matters every day, that we can't take anything for granted.
In the United States, President Joe Biden reacted to the Supreme Court ruling removing the constitutional protection of American women's abortion rights.
The court literally taking America back 150 years. This is a sad day for the country, in my view. But it doesn't mean the fight's over.
We turn now to the continuing crisis for Canadians hoping to travel and waiting for a passport. For months now, record delays have been leading to lineups, even frustrated travelers camping out in front of passport offices. Trips have been cancelled, and some Canadians are furious. The minister responsible for the passport office, Karina Gould, on Thursday announced yet more measures to try to deal with the crisis. But Andrew Griffith says it was all predictable and it could largely have been avoided. He's a former Director General at Immigration and Citizenship Canada and a former top official at Service Canada. Mr. Griffith, thank you very much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you've been quoted as saying that the departmental forecasts for 2022-2023 were already warning about a surge in demand and applications for passports. Can you explain what was suggested, what was known, what was forecast?
Well, the plan makes it clear that the department expected a surge given the expected end of the pandemic and given a relaxation of travel restrictions. So that was certainly known to the policy folks that worked on the departmental plan. What is less clear is how that information was transferred or transmitted or acted upon or not acted upon by Service Canada, which actually delivers the processing and the in-person service.
Is it, to you though, is it conceivable that this would not be passed on? This is the basic functioning of one of the core functions of the federal government.
I think it must have been passed on, and I think the ESDC plan also makes mention of this. So I don't think it was a question of the information not being passed on. I think it's more a question that the information wasn't acted upon.
Why would it not be acted on? I mean, we're looking at this crisis now where people are canceling holidays and camping out in front of passport offices. Why do you think it would not be acted on?
Well, unfortunately, sometimes there are other factors, other priorities that get attention, and a regular program like Passport, which by and large is generally under the radar for most of the time, gets missed over. So I don't actually know exactly what happened, but it is really startling, that disconnect between what was in the plan and what actually happened in the images you're showing now of lineups.
Mm-hmm. Some people suggested that Service Canada already before the pandemic was having problems, structural problems and service delivery problems. During the pandemic, they were definitely busy and many offices were closed. Could this be pandemic related? Like, we have a fatigue, we have, I don't know. Do you have any other explanation for it?
Well, obviously, everybody, whether in government or in the private sector, has a certain level of COVID fatigue. But we really do count upon government to meet its core responsibilities, or if not able to do it, to communicate in advance of those difficulties, some of the ways that people can alleviate it. And so, if you can't fix it, at least you communicate better.
Yeah, raise a red flag. Okay, I want to put to you some of the measures that have been announced. I mean, this week, the minister has been announcing yet another wave of measures. She's announcing a triage process where managers are going to wade into the lineups at passport offices in Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. And they will then have a first contact with people who have immediate flights in 24, 36, 48 hours. What do you make of that measure?
I think it's helpful, because I think one of the things that drives most people crazy if they're in a lineup is not knowing where they are in the lineup and how long it's going to take. And so if you have people sort of wandering through the lineup and doing that triage, I think it gives people a sense that at least they're being listened to and that they're going to be treated at some point in time in the process, depending on their priorities triage.
Now, does that go very far, though, to addressing the core issue, which is these huge delays, the backlog in processing cases?
Oh, it alleviates it, but it doesn't solve the core problem. No, but I think for some people it will make a difference, and for the people that in lineups actually sort of not getting any news for 3 or 4 hours, it should make a difference as well. The
minister's also announced a crash hiring program and training of new passport officers. She says there's even possibility of transferring some personnel from other departments like Stats Canada. How long does it take to train enough people to deal with the backlogs? You're aware of the extent of the backlogs.
I don't have a precise figure for you, but I mean, there are parts of the passport process that are relatively straightforward in terms of training somebody so they can go through a passport application form and check that it's complete. That's probably fairly straightforward. When you get in actually sort of processing and decisions in terms of whether to grant the passport, that's more complex, and that may take some more time.
Okay. The worst of the crisis, we're showing, a lot of the images we're showing are especially in Montreal. The crisis seems to be so much more acute in Montreal, where we see the people camping overnight. Any idea or any inkling about why the situation may be so much more acute in Quebec region?
I really don't know. It may be the fact that they have fewer offices in the Montreal, so everybody goes to the main office and there are longer lineups, but that's speculation on my part.
Okay. What needs to be done, what still remains to be done, and how confident are you, and what time frame do you think we'll see before they can get some of these backlogs reduced?
I think we're probably talking about a number of months. Backlogs usually take time to deal with. Training takes time. The system takes a while to gear up. Will we have, certainly by the end of the summer, the peak travel season, there shouldn't be problems, but that doesn't help the people who are in lining up right now.
Yeah, you're aware of the political balance that one makes in these sort of things. You're talking about a peak travel season. If these problems persist throughout the entire travel season, politically, there's going to be a lot of people very angry at the government.
Well, I mean, I really get concerned about these kinds of issues in terms of the level of trust in government. Because if people perceive that the government can't deliver on its core responsibilities, and which passport is obviously one of them, it may cause them to lose trust in government and faith that the government can address other problems. And we've seen this not only in the case of passports, but we see it in healthcare with respect to provinces. We see that at the other delays at the airports and the like. So I think it's actually a broader issue than just passports.
Okay, Mr. Griffith, thank you very much. Thanks for speaking with us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Well, it is time now to take a step back and look at the spring sitting of Parliament. What were the big issues? How did the MPs that you elected deal with them? What was handled well? And which files were fumbled? And where do things go from here? To look at it all, I'm joined by three avid federal political watchers. Bob Fife is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Globe and Mail. Niigaan Sinclair is a columnist for the Winnipeg Free Press. And Joanna Smith is the Ottawa Bureau Chief for the Canadian Press. All three of you, welcome.
Thanks for having us.
Okay, now attach your seatbelts because we have so much to cover. Let's start with the issue that sort of rounded out the year. The last question period, what was front and center in the last question period in the House was these allegations or accusations from a Nova Scotia RCMP superintendent saying that he and his colleagues had come under pressure from RCMP Commissioner Brenda Lucki to release information on the weapons which were used in the mass shooting in 2020. And he says that the commissioner referred to the federal government's upcoming gun legislation, that she made commitments to have that information released. Just to set the record, the public safety minister from the time, Bill Blair, has denied that there was any federal interference. The Prime Minister has said that there was no, quote, undue pressure exerted. Commissioner Lucki of the RCMP has said she, quote, did not interfere in the investigation. Briefly, where do you think this is all headed? How serious is this, Bob?
Look, I think it's very serious. There does appear to be, from Superintendent Darren Campbell's notes, an attempt by the Commissioner of the RCMP to ask the police to compromise their investigation to help the Liberals' gun agenda. And complicating this is Friday, the news that those 4 pages had been withheld by the Justice Department and only been provided to the government, to the Commission of Inquiry, May 31st, and only released on Tuesday. So this is beginning to smell like they knew that those notes were bad and they didn't really want to release them. And remember this, Mr. Trudeau said during the SNC-Lavalin case there was no undue pressure on Jody Wilson-Raybould. So I think this is very serious. We do need to have those parliamentary hearings. We do need to hear from Commissioner Lucki, who is still has refused to say whether to deny or confirm whether she did in fact tell those officers that she had promised Bill Blair, then the public safety minister, and the Prime Minister's office that she would release those guns so that would help them with their pending gun ban on assault rifles.
Okay. Briefly, Niigaan and Joanna. Niigaan, what do you make of it? What are you watching for?
Well, I mean, we've had a good overview of what's led to the event itself. I mean, during the recent Ontario election, there was overwhelming support for the gun bans that the Liberals are seeking to introduce. And that's important because the issue really has to do with a cover-up of pages during an investigation, not so much around the issue itself. And that's the key here, which I think is what's giving the issue legs. So the government had better be ready to come out and talk a little bit about those missing pages and how that impacts the investigation, because they've actually got a lot of public support for the gun ban itself. Okay, Joanne, thoughts on this? I know the Public Safety Committee has said that it's going to be hearing from some of the key actors in all of this, the Commons Public Safety Committee.
I think the interesting thing that came out yesterday was when Trudeau was asked whether he has confidence in Commissioner Lucki. He said he does, but then when asked whether she acted appropriately, he referred back to her own statement and sort of left her to speak for herself. Her statement was really interesting in that it sort of noted that she would have done things differently in that meeting and how she conveyed that information to the Nova Scotia RCMP. So I think that will be a key thing to watch going forward.
Okay, let's look at that was an issue that dominated the last days of Parliament. What would you say briefly is the biggest issue of the whole spring sitting? Start with you, Bob.
Look, I think it has to be the economy. You know, we've seen inflation spike up to nearly 8%. Although there's a lot of people working, there are big problems in terms of supply chains. There's big problems in terms of getting enough workers. We've got a 1 million+ backlog of people coming into the country, which we need for the workforce. But largely, it's inflation and how the government is handling this. Now, it's a global phenomenon. It's not just isolated only to Canada. But the government, this is going to be not only the problem, I think, facing the government this spring, and as you know, it dominated question periods with the Conservatives and NDP talking about how the government is going to deal with inflation and whether they should be, cutting gas prices or cutting the carbon tax to help people. This is going to be something that's going to be dominating, I think, for the rest of the year and probably into next year as well, because inflation is not going to come down very soon, and this is going to lead to wage spirals and all of those kind of awful things that people of my generation remember from the 1980s and early 1990s when inflation was out of control. So it's a serious issue that affects Canadians, but it's also going to have an effect on the government and their popularity with Canadians if they can't handle it properly.
Okay, Niigaan, what would you elect as the biggest issue this spring?
Well, my first one was around the economy, but just a reminder that 45% of Canadians poll came out today to say that they feel that the situation is worse than 1 year ago, and so certainly the issue of inflation, the economy is on Canadians' minds at the moment. However, I do believe it's coming back sooner than expected, and most people within the Bank of Canada are suggesting that. But if I were to pick another issue that would be very close, of course, it's the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine is the impetus around much of this inflation. It has certainly sped it up in lots of different ways. And, right here in Manitoba, we are the largest population of Ukrainians outside of Ukraine. It is a crucial issue that's facing people along here on the prairies. It's talked about every day. And the fact that right now the war is definitely turning in the favor of Russia. There are 100 to 200 Ukrainians being killed every day, around 500 being wounded every day. That is a much different situation than what was happening on the early stages of the war. As the globe, the world turns its attention more to its own internal issues around the economy, it's turning away from Ukraine. And the fact that this is something that Canada has to continue to keep supporting, keep on the national agenda. It's something that I think many politicians are bringing up constantly, time and time again, that Ukraine is something Canada can't forget.
Okay, Joanna, your nomination for what you consider the biggest issue.
I also chose the war in Ukraine, not just for what it's doing domestically to the economy, but also just larger around the world and where the world is headed. I remember the day that Russia did launch its invasion, we asked Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, could this mean the end of the post-war order? And I remember her answer kind of chilling me, where she said it could be, right? And there are absolutely other conflicts around the world. And I think we need, as Canadians, to think critically about why this one resonates so strongly on both an individual and societal level. I think that has informed the way Canada has responded to the Ukrainian refugee crisis, coming up with very creative ways to get people here very quickly they have not done for other conflicts. But it does resonate. It is affecting inflation. It's affecting the price of everything. It's affecting stability. And yet it's one of those things where Canada's really tied in its ability to do much about it. They've brought in sanctions. There's some evidence that they are having some effect. They've sent military aid. And yet the risk of NATO entering an actual war with Russia is one reason that no one's bringing in a no-fly zone, which is one thing Ukraine had asked for early on to end things. So it is something that is continuing and will continue to cause a lot of disruption in Canada and the world. Okay,
I want to turn to the most poorly handled issue this spring. What did the government have difficulty with? What did it botch? Bob?
Well, for my mind, it's Afghanistan. I've been doing a lot of stories on Afghanistan. I've been talking to people in Afghanistan who had worked for Canada's military and diplomatic mission there. Many of these people, thousands of these people, had submitted applications to the Immigration Department and have still not received any reply. And they are in hiding, and they are frightened for their lives, and it is heartbreaking to talk to them on the phone. They worked either as security guards or for Canadian aid agencies or as interpreters. Mm-hmm. Now, Canada has done a decent job in some ways of bringing at least 16,000 out, and they recently have made efforts to facilitate the removal of the rescue of people who are in Afghanistan who have gotten their approvals from the Canadian government, and Pakistan has helped by restoring transit visas. So several thousand people are now going to get out, but there are so many other people that have still not got their approvals, and they are so frightened. And we have an obligation to these people. It's just heartbreaking when you have them on the phone or on WhatsApp and they're crying and they're in hiding. And I think that the government has done a great job in Ukraine, They moved mountains to help the Ukrainians come to this country as temporary residents. Surely we can do the same thing for Afghanistan.
Okay, I want to move quickly through this. Niigaan, if you had to choose one thing that was really bedeviled the government, something that was badly handled, what would it be?
I would pick something that's actually impacted all of the parties, particularly the two leading parties, and it's the Freedom Convoy, the handling of the Freedom Convoy issue, and the fact that it was paralyzed Ottawa for weeks. It created a very divisive situation, which was between the governing Liberals and a segment of Canadians that feels disenfranchised and feel quite opposition to the policies. I think that was a direct result to some of the hard lines that we're taking during the pandemic. Mm-hmm. And then, of course, the Conservative Party, which has a bit of a Jekyll and Hyde relationship with the Freedom Convoy, particularly in the leadership campaign, in that there seems to be no universal agreement among Conservatives of whether they are Freedom Convoy supporters or not. Mm-hmm. And you really saw that during the time in which those in Ottawa were occupying that space. I mean, it was a colossal disaster for, I think, all parties involved, and particularly the city of Ottawa. But it was also an issue, I think, in which Canadians got to see people just outright flout and ignore the law and generally not get any consequences as a result. I mean, it was a situation and a movement that was funded predominantly by Americans, and Americans on their hard right, and it created a huge divisive situation in this country that parties just weren't able to handle.
Okay, I want to, Joanne, I want to ask you, and I know we've alluded to it, but I think this is your choice in terms of the worst handled issue.
Yeah, I chose inflation, and not in the sense that it's within the government's control. As Bob was saying earlier, this is happening on a global scale, and of course, as we know, it's really the Bank of Canada's job to set the direction and keep a target inflation, and they've come under heavy criticism for that, and now they're having to correct things rather aggressively, which is bringing, I think, an additional layer of pain to some people when we think about rising interest rates. But it's and that's allowed people like Pierre Poilievre, for example, to go after the Bank of Canada's governor and the Liberal government in a way that I think resonates with people, even if it is potentially walking a dangerous line. It's one thing for governments and economists and banks to understand this. I think it can be really hard to understand these larger global forces at play and the role the war is playing in this when people are trying to pay for their groceries. And I think what may be missing from the Liberal government is that sort of Bill Clinton, I feel your pain response. Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland, she made this speech where she talked about government measures to respond to inflation. She talked about nearly $9 billion in financial supports introduced by the government. But those were things that were already in play. They were in the budgets for the past couple of years. So I think it's a bit of a hard spin to sell it as a direct response to something that's happening now. And, they pointed to childcare reduction, fees reduction as part of the answer. And that will help a lot of people, but it is also a larger legacy project they were already planning to do. And I just think there's a lot of anger in the world right now, and people are trying to figure out where to direct it at. It's being channeled by the Conservatives in ways that Niigaan was mentioning during the Freedom Convoy. It might come back to bite them too, frankly, harnessing that energy. So I just really think it's a tough one for all parties to figure out how to handle.
We are running out of time, so I'm going to get you to give me short answers for this then, because we're rapidly running out of time. I'm going to stay with you, Joanna. If we look at another issue, and that is the most undercovered issue, an issue that could have been better covered or more covered, just quickly in a few words.
I would say the opioids crisis. Since 2016, some 29,000 people have died. There's some evidence to suggest it's getting worse under the COVID-19 pandemic. And so in addition to being a human tragedy, it's also a politically fascinating one in terms of where British Columbia is headed on decriminalization, and it'll be interesting to watch to see whether that plays out across Canada as well. Okay,
Niigaan, for an undercovered issue, what would it be?
I think Canadians generally aren't hearing of how this is the first time in 4 years we have stability in the federal government because of the confidence and supply agreement between the NDP and the Liberals. I think that we don't often talk about the use of minority parliaments, or we think of them as bad and we think of them as not useful. But we've got two major bills that came through, the Broadcasting Act and the National Dental Care Program. And of course, not to mention the child care with the agreement with the provinces. I mean, all of these things come from when parties work together. And I think it's sometimes important for us as media to tell the public this is because people are working together across partisan lines and getting things done. And so this is coming from an agreement within a minority parliament. Okay,
Bob, an undercovered issue, in a few words, what would it be?
Okay, notwithstanding the NDP Liberal deal, to me, my biggest concern is that I don't think we've done a good enough job covering the Conservative leadership race, because Mr. Trudeau is not a very popular figure. They've screwed up a lot of files, and if the Conservatives elect a populist Trump-like person and they win power, that's not going to be good for this country. So I think we need to have I would like to see the media have a better understanding of what is actually happening out there on the ground. Is Pierre Poilievre, as we believe, really the front runner, or are the Conservatives, mainline Conservatives, really thinking that this guy is the guy who could be the next Prime Minister? I don't know that. And I think I'd love us to be able to get a little more meat on that to find out what's actually going on the ground amongst Conservatives.
Okay, I want to ask you a question. This is one that's always interesting. The MP or the minister from from any party or from either side of the aisle, an MP or a minister who caught your attention, who impressed you in this spring sitting. Start with you, Bob.
I'm going to be nonpartisan here, so I want to pick Raquel Dancho, who is the public safety critic for the Conservatives, and Heather McPherson, who's the NDP foreign affairs critic. Both of them are very strong performers. They know their facts. They're good on television. They're good in interviews, and they're up-and-coming stars, it seems to me.
All right. Niigaan, who impressed you in this spring sitting?
I'm going to pick Mark Miller. And, I think oftentimes ministers of Indigenous affairs, the two that we have now, they don't get a lot of credit. And certainly when they're doing well, you don't hear about it because it's like being perhaps a hockey referee. It's best when you don't notice them. So I'll pick out Mark Miller for this one. I mean, we had just a recent agreement, $1.3 billion with the Siksika Nation, settling 46,000 hectares. That was decades. That took decades to solve, and it took Mark Miller to bring it over the finish line, not to mention all the other issues. I mean, think about how the issues of unmarked graves have been handled and how it is not as much an issue that's been contentious among Canadians. Generally, people have come to an understanding with that issue, as well as the fact that 1 year ago, people were pulling down statues and marching in the streets. And here we are this year in a much different conversation. And I think it's in large part to the humility, the listening abilities of Mark Miller, in which he's been able to bring things really not in the same, we haven't seen this kind of thing since the days of Jane Philpott. Jane Philpott was also very popular amongst Indigenous peoples as well.
Last words. Literally, we only have about 15 seconds. Joanna, who would you choose? Who impressed you this sitting?
Defense Minister Niigaan Sinclair, I think it was expected she'd do better than her predecessor on the sexual misconduct in the military file, but she also had a war land in her lap. And it was interesting to see her come out ahead of the budget and say that she was pushing for much higher spends. Asterisk on that, she didn't quite get it, and there's still lots that remains to be proven, but I think she has stood out not just on the sexual misconduct in the military file, but also the handling of the war in Ukraine.
Okay, all three of you, I want to thank you. We covered a lot of ground, and there's always a lot, and we will no doubt have a chance to talk about the year to come as well at some point. I want to thank all three of you, and have a great weekend.
Thank you.
Yeah, miigwech. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, that's all for another edition of Primetime Politics. I'm Martin Stringer. Thanks for watching, and have a great weekend.